So the YouTube channel, The Setup Man, that specializes in Chicago Cubs content, who also happen to be my team, recently released a video, which was a reaction to another video by the baseball YouTube channel iTalk Studios. Both videos will be linked for you below. The original video by iTalk Studios posited that the Dansby Swanson contract the Cubs signed is basically bad. I am in agreement with the sentiment put forth by iTalk Studios. The Setup Man seems to disagree, at least a little bit, so I am going to respond to the points the Setup Man made in his video. Let's begin.
But there's another deal on the books for the Cubs that I never looked at as a great signing to begin with, but I didn't realize just how truly bad it looks right now, and that's the Dansby Swanson contract.
Okay, iTalk Studios, I've got a reaction for your video about Dansby Swanson. You did back-to-back videos about Cody Bellinger and Dansby Swanson. I'm going to link the full one for Dansby below. I'll also link the one for Cody Bellinger. And listen, Cubs fans, well, I don't love the Dansby Swanson contract. I do think iTalk Studios, who, by the way, I'm subscribed to because I love their content, I think we exaggerated this one. I'm not defending Dansby Swanson, okay? I am just saying that it's not as bad as what he's about to share.
It's similar to the Tigers signing Javi Baez.
No.
Okay, right here, I can see Setup Man is not pleased with the comparison to the Javi Baez contract. Now, I think Swanson's contract is bad, but I will admit it's not quite as bad as the Javier Baez deal.
From the moment they signed him away from Atlanta, my feeling was just, it's nothing crazy. Sure, it's a good, solid baseball player to add to your team, but probably an overpay. And 2 years into this contract, I'm going to go as far as to say it's an extreme overpay and a really unnecessary move for the Cubs to make. Any team would be perfectly fine with paying Dansby Swanson $10 million, which is the most the Braves ever paid him in a single season, his last before signing with the Cubs.
So this mention of the contract and what the Braves are willing to pay and what any other team is willing to play versus what the Cubs paid, it's just not a fair statement, because $10 million the year before is his arbitration years. And anytime you get paid $10 million in an arbitration year, which is a really handsome salary, you're going to likely at least double that if you're signing a long-term contract. And if we go back to all the contracts that were signed during that time, it was Trey Turner, it was Xander Bogaerts, and it was Carlos Correa. Every single one of them was flirting with $300 million. And then Dansby Swanson comes in at a bargain at $25 million compared to the rest of those guys. And at the end of the day, we're going to look at their WARs. He's a better player overall in the last 2 seasons.
On this point, yes, Swanson was a bargain compared to them, but all 3 of them had produced better years previously than Swanson, at least offensively. And let's face it, offense is vastly more important and valued in baseball than defense. And you mentioned a key word here, bargain. This is the way the Cubs of today operate, is by looking strictly for what they consider to be bargains. The bargain bin shoppers of baseball, who are kings in the 3rd largest market in the country, and who generated the 3rd most revenue in baseball back in 2023. So the Cubs generated the 3rd most revenue in baseball, but were outspent by teams that made less money than they did, like Philadelphia, Houston, Atlanta, and the Mets, who made far less than they did in 2023.
And at the end of the day, we're going to look at their WARs. He's a better player overall in the last 2 seasons. Here they are, last 2 seasons. Dansby Swanson leads the way with a 9.2 F4. Trey Turner is next at 8. Carlos Correa at 6.1. And Xander Bogaerts at 6.6. So I'm looking at this and I'm like, yeah, I mean, if you told me in the first 2 seasons that Dansby Swanson was going to have the highest F4 of any of these 3 players and he was going to come at the cheapest number, sign me up.
Okay, on this point, it's true that Swanson generated more WAR than the other 3 shortstops that were signed that year, but as pointed out before, it's largely based on defense, which simply is not as valuable as offense in baseball. Juan Soto is soon going to be either the highest paid or 2nd highest paid player in baseball, and his defense sucks. This is simply because teams value offense way more than defense. So you have to break it down by a player's offensive and defensive WAR, and not simply WAR alone. All WAR is not created equal. Comparing Swanson's offensive WAR to the other 3 players for the past 2 seasons, we can see that Bogaerts generated a total of 16.5 offensive WAR, while Swanson generated 10.3. Trey Turner had a total O-WAR of 34.6, and Carlos Correa generated a total O-WAR of 16.6. Even with negative offensive WARs for two of the players in a single season, all three of them still produced a greater overall offensive WAR than Swanson did. The reason for this is that Swanson has simply never been a very good hitter, but we'll get to that in a minute. Let's continue.
Swanson's contract is for over $25 million a year over 7 years, and he's the highest paid Cub. That's a good chunk of money and a long commitment. Forget the time he's since played in Chicago. Was what Swanson did in the 6 years he played in Atlanta worth giving him that contract? No. If you're going to give anybody that much money over that many years, you gotta expect them to hit pretty damn well. Maybe not MVP level, but all-star level for sure. Maybe top 10 in MVP votes. Something along those lines.
iTalk is 100% correct here. It was not worth giving Swanson that money based on what he did in Atlanta.
Okay, so was top 12 in MVP votes not good enough for you? Because that's what we just said. If we look at his F-WAR in the 6 years, let's just assume for a second his first year, his actual rookie year, it wasn't good, right? The only year he was a negative F-WAR player, and then 18, he was fine. He was 1.7. 2019, 1.9. 2020, in 60 games, he was a 2.1 player. He found something in 2020 there, and it was a short span, and so you can't really take that into serious consideration. But then he goes back out there the next 2 years and surpasses what he did in 2020 to where he was essentially a stud in 2022.
And what a shocker this is. A player had a career year in his walk year? Like, we haven't seen that before.
You're making all these statements without actually doing the fact checking. And it's disappointing because I like your channel and I like the videos that you put together. This one, I just think you kind of slapped together based on some feelings. And it's unfortunate because it's not a credible video because of these reasons.
There's just one slight issue. Dansby Swanson was never a very good hitter. He wasn't awful, and he did improve in his later years with the Braves, but he was never that valuable offensively.
100% accurate.
He was always strictly a defensive shortstop, which is important and fine to have if you don't have him on a big contract and when you have a ton of heavy hitters around him like the Braves did for years.
Okay, now this I agree with you, because yes, he was not a hitter. He had a really good season his last year as a Brave, which is why you see that 6.6 F-WAR, and it was his best offensive year by far, and he was trending up. So was there reason to believe that maybe he would continue to trend up? Sure.
No. Hard disagree here. There was not, in fact, a reason to believe he would continue trending up. As most people who follow sports can tell you, a player's peak years are typically from 25 to 30. Once they hit 30, things typically, not always, start trending down, and the decline can sometimes be precipitous. What age did Dansby start playing for us? Oh, yes, 29, right on the cusp of the decline years.
Jed Hoyer said when he signed Dansby Swanson that this is a guy that we believe in year 1 and year 7 is the most likely of the options out there to continue to be a shortstop. And for a team that has a need for some leadership as well, especially on the infield with all the prospects that are coming up, you need a guy like Dansby Swanson who can bring some guys in. Think about this for a second. When Matt Shaw comes up, when James Triantos comes up, when Cam Smith comes up, who they're going to rely on to help ease them into their roles, that's Dansby Swanson. Yeah, it's going to be the infield coaches. It's going to be the coaches as well. It's going to be their AAA coaches. But Dansby Swanson can be that guy to come in and be like, hey, here's how you do this at the major league level.
It's all fine and good to be a mentor to younger players, but that still is not worth $25 million a year.
I'm defending Jed on this one because I think that that's where his mind was at, but also from just a pure athletic standpoint, he's going to be a shortstop likely for all 7 years.
He did have an above-average season offensively in his first year with the Cubs. Nothing crazy, but solid, especially when you put it with his great defense. But again, overall as a player, when you factor in his underwhelming bat, he's nothing that special, so it's already not a great deal. And then he has a 2024 season even worse. In a year where offense was down throughout the entire league, Swanson was even worse than the league average.
We keep hearing you talk about the offense. And once again, to me, it's just kind of a moot point because When you have a offensive player who is league average with a top, let's be honest, he's a top 5 defender in the game, not at shortstop, in the game. He was robbed of his 3rd Gold Glove this year because of this Gold Glove with Rawlings just becoming an absolute joke of an award. When you give it to a guy and Mason Wynn who made 18 errors at shortstop and don't even allow Francisco Lindor to be a finalist, something isn't adding up over there.
As I've already covered, offense is much more valuable than defense. If you're a top 20 paid offensive player in the game, which Swanson is, the team that signs you needs to ensure that they're getting a guy that can hit well. You don't need to be great, but you need to hit better than just an average player.
So one of the things that he's not taking into consideration is that Dansby Swanson had a knee injury in basically the beginning of May that put him on the IL for a little bit of time. And then when he came back, it just felt a little bit rushed. And so going back to when that knee injury happened, it was basically over a 62-game stretch that he actually played on that knee. And he was only batting .218, a 625 OPS, only had 5 home runs. But then he came back, and in his final 52 games of the season, .282 batting average, 822 OPS, 7 home runs. He found that stroke, and he was one of the better hitters for the Cubs. So we've gone through these moments where Dansby Swanson is, you could say, a streaky hitter, but in 23, he also had that foot injury. And so there have been some injuries that have probably impacted him at the plate that we don't really know what a full, truly healthy season looks like from Dansby Swanson quite yet he still leads all these shortstops that were signed in 2020, going into the 2023 season in F4. That's valuable.
Okay, I'll finish up on this point he's making. We can blame injuries for Swanson's poor performance at the plate, but there's 2 things that need to be said in regards to this. 1, the injuries have not seemed to diminish his defense any, and if he was really hurt and not feeling 100%, you would think running around trying to grab balls out of the dirt and sliding around on the ground would be affected more than his hitting, especially with a foot injury. And 2, as I stated earlier, he's going into his decline years. The injuries are more than likely going to continue piling up and becoming more severe as he ages. So I think my point has pretty much been made. I'm not trying to say that Swanson is a bad player, because he's not. He's a good, but not great player that's mostly a defensive specialist, and defensive specialists do not deserve $25 million a year. The entire reason the Cubs signed Swanson is because their MO is to allow what they consider to be one big contract at a time. In Cubs terms, a big contract is anything that's 5+ years or $175 million plus in total money. Their previous big contract was Jason Hayward. We finally rid ourselves of that albatross, so the Cubs said to themselves, we are allowed another one because we need to placate our fans, but just one, and we want to keep it as reasonable as possible. So that's what they did, and what we can call the off-season of the 4 shortstops. They went bargain bin hunting again, and signed the cheapest of the 4. This is why we have already been hearing this offseason that they will not be in on any of the big free agents, because they already have their one big free agent, Swanson, and they'll only allow one of those types of contracts at a time. When the team is top 3 in generated revenue, they need to be at least top 5 in payroll.